Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering commitment to the cause of great conversation, your humble friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me today. My guest today is Sabrina Little. Sabrina is a guest unlike any other with whom I've had the good fortune and pleasure to chat. After studying philosophy and psychology at the College of William and Mary, the second eldest of America's institutes of higher learning, Sabrina received advanced degrees from Yale Divinity School and Baylor University, from which she took her PhD in philosophy in the year 2020. At present, she is an associate professor of philosophy at Virginia's Christopher Newport University, my apologies, at which another guest of the show, Jonathan White, is also a teacher in the Department of History, in the case that your paths ever cross. Speaking of paths, Professor Little is a highly decorated trail runner, ultramarathoner, and endurance athlete whose accomplishments will stun you. Are you ready? She is a 5-time U.S. national champion, the holder of multiple records, including the distance traversed in 24 hours, 152 miles, and the 200K, about 120 miles, for whose traversal she needed only 19 hours and 30 minutes. And in 2019, she ran the fastest 100K and 50-mile times for women in the US. I must confess, merely recounting these unthinkably long distances run in such dizzyingly short times leaves me somewhat short of breath. For that reason, I'll stop talking momentarily to thank you, Sabrina, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
The title of your book is The Examined Run. Now, Socrates famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. Can the same be said of running? Is the unexamined run unworthy of being run?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, so that's what I got the title from, that Socratic phrase. And yeah, I was just thinking about running kind of in a serious, like, self-examining sort of way, and thinking about the ways I was being formed by running, and for good and for ill, and thinking that, like, should I not be asking these questions? I mean, whether or not I'm asking the question, I'm being formed by running in certain ways. And so I don't know if it would be a very good running life if I were not examining, what I was doing in my sneakers on a regular basis and the consequences of doing so.
It's my assumption that you were always a very conscious person, a somewhat meditative person, right? You went into psychology and thereafter into philosophy. So did you find that you were always a little bit more mindful of your activity as you are participating in it as a young person and then as an adult?
Yes and no. I mean, I definitely enjoyed kind of living questions, like big questions about what we're doing here and what a good life is and what a good character is. And I was grateful to go to a good set of schools growing up where I was introduced kind of to these big questions and great texts. But for a long time, I didn't really bring my philosophy life to bear on my running. I liked to keep them kind of separate just because I wanted to establish myself um, well in each place. Like, so I didn't want to do philosophy of sport. I didn't want to ask philosophical questions of running. I wanted running to be my leisure, and I wanted it to be this competitive space that was sort of separate. And it was only much later that I really just started to see a kind of fruitful engagement of philosophy with my running, and take that more seriously.
And around what time did that happen in your life?
Yeah, probably, I don't know, about a decade ago, was the first time I started really blogging about my running. And so I would write about just whatever exploits I was doing. And when you're writing about running, there's a lot of introspection involved. Um, but then when I started coaching a team of cross country and track and field athletes, and started trying to think about how I could coach them for character, I realized that it was just very compatible with the work that I was doing academically. I was very interested in character development simplicator, and then applying it in the athletic space was just like a natural extension of that kind of work.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned that, yes, you've written prodigiously or prolifically about running on various websites, to which we can, of course, include links in the show notes. Um, so you obviously are emphasizing character development. Um, Before we get deeper into that question of character, I want to ask you, with your practice and with your studies, how have you come to run philosophically? How does one go about that? Right. So, many people approach running or exercise more generally with an unbearable sense of dread. Very few of us want to think about it. We want it to be put into the backs of our minds. It's the very last thing that we want to consider. So, how does one approach running philosophically?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so there are different ways that I could answer this question. I mean, first of all, the practice of running itself, there are some days when it just affords you a lot of space to reflect. So in my daily work, I am doing a lot of writing on the computer and answering students' emails and attending meetings and delivering lectures and things like that. And while it's work that is philosophical, ironically, it leaves me with little space to reflect or have distance from tasks. And when I'm out running is really when I have this kind of blank canvas or free space to do the work of wondering about things or bridging connections between things that I've read. And so it's been a really fruitful space for just generating ideas and thinking and wondering and doing the act of being human and experiencing awe and things like that. So there's that. I think living an examined running life looks like asking yourself hard questions about your running. I think it means like having a kind of honesty extended to the practice and checking your motivations and asking yourself hard questions about how it fits into a good life. Like I think that's part of the examined running life. So it's with respect to the practice itself, it's finding philosophical moments within, finding space to wonder. And I think running positions us well for that. But I think it also involves like asking questions of what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? Is this an unqualified good in my life, or are there ways that it's detracting from what I see as choice worthy?
I question that every single morning at about 6:30 a.m. when I lace up my shoes and get out on the road. And
Yeah.
yet we still do it. I, myself, and many others. I have a couple of questions in response to what you said. The first is somewhat tangential to our topic, but in academia, you said that there's less time actually to philosophize, to participate in the action of philosophy. Are you surprised by that? Right? You graduated with your PhD, or you took your PhD about 5 years ago now, and I congratulate you for that. But as you entered into academia and became a professor, did you anticipate to having so little time actually to think about big ideas the way you do when you're running?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I was surprised by it. I mean, so the day is divided into, I try to build space for my research and my writing, and that does involve it involves reflection, it involves figuring out definitions, clarifications, things like that. And that is a kind of reflection, but usually it's so task oriented that sometimes it leaves little space to wonder about things. And then there's the other side of the discipline, which is just, it's very pragmatic. It's managing a grade book, it's responding to emails. And, like in the classical tradition, they talk about this tension between like the practical life and the contemplative life, and you really encounter that sort of tension in the life of the academic because you're being pulled in these different directions. Some of the most reflective philosophical professors that I've ever had we're also bad at answering emails because sometimes it's like those things pull you in different directions. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's just like part of a human life in general, just having to do things that are more prudential and managing your regular affairs instead of just spending time reflecting. Um, I think that it's funny when I talk to people who, I tell them, they ask what my job is. And if I say philosopher, they think that I'm just lying on the floor contemplating the cosmos on a daily basis. And
Wouldn't
I
that be
think they would,
nice?
yeah, yeah. And I do have, I mean, the life of a professor is wonderful. I have more time to read great books and reflect on them with my students and things like that. But there's a lot more of that kind of tethering down to earth, making sure that you are responding to emails, making sure you're at the meetings and other stuff throughout the day.
Of course, of course. And secondly, you mentioned the creativity of which running is provocative. I've found this to be the case in my own life. Surely fMRI scans of the brain have been performed that would indicate the regions of the brain that are most illuminated and active during a run or during moderately intense or mildly intense exercise. I find that once I'm in maybe a low zone two, which is just means your heart rate's in a certain range. When I'm in that sort of zone, or even a little bit slower, and then after a run, I'm most creatively fertile. Now, what that produces sometimes is questionable, right? If it's a poem or a song lyric or an idea for a business, sometimes things don't come to fruition. Oftentimes they don't. But I do find it to be the case that while running and in the aftermath of the run, I'm most creatively fertile. Do you feel similarly during and after your runs? And do you have any explanation as to why that might be the case?
Yes and no. So there are times when so when I'm running fast, when I'm doing workouts, when I'm doing like interval training or something like that, I am managing every moment and I'm just present there, not thinking about anything else except for the next rep. But you're right, like when you're in the zone two space or you're just in a rhythm, even during tempo runs, extended tempo runs or something like that, I often find that I enter this space where it's a lot easier to just turn your mind somewhere else. And that space is really fruitful to wonder about things. And I don't know, I mean, I don't know if people experience the same thing in other practices. Like maybe gardeners experience the same thing when they're in that rhythm, or maybe bowlers, mentally go somewhere else. But for me, running has been a very fruitful space for just kind of like if I'm stuck with an idea and I can't figure out how to like rearrange a paper or something like that, like having that time away where I'm not doing some other pragmatic task and I'm just running and letting everything wash over me is the very, yeah, it's very generative in terms of helping in my work.
Yeah. Uh, I find that you can really direct your mind in many different ways during runs. For instance, you said being present in the moment during those harder, more intense interval runs. And yes, you're precisely right. At other times, I'm just simply focusing on my breath. At other times, the creative ideas overcome me, and my mind begins to flutter and to kind of get away from me at times. And then, of course, with discipline, you bring it back and you refocus your attention on the present. Uh, there's a word that's been repeated, and that is wonder. And I'm reminded of a quote by Plato, who said that philosophy begins in wonder. Do you use that word knowingly in as a way of paying homage to Plato, or is that just something that you feel, this sense of wonder, and is it maybe part of your vocabulary?
No, I mean, I'm very steeped in the ancients. Most of what I say is probably come from Plato or Aristotle. Yeah, so I know you're right. Philosophy begins in wonder. Yeah, and I mean, there are refrains of that similar kind of line throughout the history of philosophy. One thing I worry about with my students is like they don't have that space anymore. I mean, they walk into their classroom on their phones. They're on their phones until the lecture starts, and then they immediately take out their phones and put their heads down and just are truly transfixed by these glowing rectangles. And I mean, it's so easy to become that way in this like context that we're in, but I wonder like, or I worry that they're not wondering, right? And sometimes I'll ask them great questions like, what does it mean to be a human, or what is a good life? And it's the kind of thing that they want to Google, as though Google is going to be a source of wisdom. And it's not, it's a source of information or knowledge. And so having that kind of humanizing practice of engaging in a serious inquiry, maybe talking about it with people, reflecting about it for yourself. I mean, I've definitely benefited from having that kind of athletic space just to remove me from the digital context. And I hope that for my students as well. Because, yeah, I mean, you can't ask big questions and take them seriously if you don't give yourself the space to wonder, to ask questions at all.
Earlier, you mentioned idly sitting beneath the cosmos and wondering about their origin and why we're here, wondering about these big questions. You are receiving students at an age at which they should be doing that, seemingly loafing about, but really thinking very deeply about, um, well, the most important questions of all. It must be somewhat demoralizing to know that so often their time that otherwise might be spent in idle speculation or deep, profound thought about the world is now diverted to, like you said, these glowing rectangles. Uh, it seems to be the case that sport, properly applied into the life of a young person, can be a sort of maybe a prophylactic against this total absorption in the phone. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, right, right. Yeah. So, and I think this is true for sports in general. I mean, it's a time when, like, if you're running around the soccer field, you don't have your phone, you're socializing, you are encountering, difficulties in the real world. If you're going for hikes, if you're gardening, if you're doing any kind of formative practice like that, it gives you that kind of distance. And running certainly does the same thing. I mean, if you try to go on your phone while you're running, you like trail running, you'll fall on a log. So it's not going to work that well. So it's this kind of built-in space to just be a human and sometimes like socialize, just removed from those sorts of things. It's funny, I read some statistic. I would misquote it if I tried to reproduce it here, but um maybe in like the 1940s, 1950s, people said a significant part of their college experience was asking big questions like, what are we doing here? What is life for? What really matters? And now people say, they speak more in terms of credentialing, that college is for, getting whatever paper that says you're qualified to do X, Y, or Z. Um, and when you think about the liberal arts, well, the liberal arts means freedom making. It's about being shaped to be a free person. You are the product of your education, not this kind of paper that you receive on the other side. So it's this kind of tragedy where like the university has lost that identity. So yeah, I really like to grab onto opportunities that give students space to think. And I do ask them the big questions in class. Like I probe them a little bit further about what does happiness actually mean? Where are you going here? Why do you want to go to business school? What's on the other side of that? What is your vision of a good life? Like those kinds of big questions.
I'd be curious to see the statistics that you were fearful of misquoting. I, I think partly the disparity in the percentages would be attributable to the way in which college then was perceived and organized. Back in the olden times, let's say, and maybe going back to the 30s and the 40s, it was typically the sons and daughters, mainly the sons, but the daughters of privilege, people of some affluence that were able to attend the university. So, a liberal arts, the pursuit of a liberal arts degree was somewhat more justifiable if you knew on the other end you'd enter into the family business, or you'd have a position in whatever banking house was owned by your father or your uncle. Whereas these days the cost of attendance is extraordinarily high, in many cases subsidized by the government with different programs, but still a sizable amount of money is being paid to procure this diploma. And what do you do with this diploma? Well, so much of its value has dissipated for a lot of different reasons, right? The admission of a lot of people, sort of grade manipulation. I'm sure you could explain exactly what's happening in the university setting better than I can. So the focus has shifted radically, as you just laid out. I think enrollment in the classics, enrollment in English literature, art history, things that might be pursued in a proper liberal arts curriculum are being eschewed in favor of, well, practical sciences, the STEM field, right? Medicine, things like that. And why? Well, mainly it's driven by the financial incentive on the other side. So I don't know. Maybe you can reply to that. I don't exactly have a question to make of that, but you're open to respond.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I mean, ironically, the freedom making of the liberal arts is for the already free, right? The people who have time and space for leisure and are not bound by necessity and don't have to worry about having on campus or off campus jobs. And you're right, like a lot of my students, I mean, they get up early, they go to work, they go to class, they're on their phones in the spaces in between. They do their work until they go to bed. And so, yeah, it sets you up not to wonder about things, not to ask big questions. And that's something that Aristotle talks about, right? Like there are certain, like when he writes about his virtue development, he's writing it for these wealthy young men of Athens who are going to be statesmen, who come from wealth and have these material conditions in place to afford that sort of thing. And so I don't know, like I really wish we were having more conversations about the identity of the university and what it's for and how we see ourselves as like forming students or not, right? Yeah, I think those are really important questions.
Uh, about which the great John Henry Newman speaks, if ever you get the
Yeah,
opportunity.
that's who I was thinking about.
Yeah, he has a fabulous, I think, trio of essays in which he talks about the true purpose of a university, and his vision of it, perhaps embellished by by his idealization, is just breathtaking, and it's wonderful to read and sort of disheartening to compare with what we now have today. So we could go further into the university, um, and I'd be fascinated to know more about your feelings pertaining it as someone who's probably a little bit more conservative inclined. I don't mean that politically, but given the fact that you studied at the Yale Divinity School and you're teaching Aristotelian philosophy, and you're a fan of Newman, it would be fascinating to know how you feel exactly about what's going on more broadly in academia. But I'll shelve that for now because I want to talk about happiness. Now, in your book, neatly enumerated are the three models of happiness. And I was hoping that you could maybe expand on them for those who are listening who haven't yet picked up a copy of your book. And those models are the hedonic, the desire satisfaction, and the eudaimonic. Now, can you briefly describe these three models and then maybe explain the supremacy of the last one listed?
Yeah. Right. So these are answers that are sometimes supplied for what a good or happy life is. And it's kind of funny, like when I say hedonic, like, oh, the good life is the one that's full of pleasure. Like people initially scoff at that and they say, well, that's not my view. But if you look at kind of how the social sciences are constructed, and you look at how the research is often performed, how they recognize like who are the people who self-identify as happy and who are not, it's defined in terms of subjective lift. Like, so having more smiley faces versus, fewer frowny faces or something like that, as though like that is a good life. And why is that ultimately not a good life? Well, it's not suited to the kind of being that we are, right? So a lot of the kind of like most significant or life-giving moments in our life, like the things that we say make our lives good, are not full of smiley faces, right? So like having children, I mean, it's rich, it's life-giving, and there are lots of frowns involved. I just like put my children to bed, and the bedtime routine, there are always frowns. And so if you're looking at that, like if you're looking at like what is going to be the simple pleasure, or what is going to grant the most smiley faces, like that's probably going to be a dead end. Marathoning, right? Marathoning is like a frown parade. There are lots of sad feelings involved. But when you get to the end, I mean, it's something you've shown yourself, you have this strength, it's satisfying, you have improved with respect to yourself in some way, like you've grown, and that is a life-giving thing. And so, yeah, that's not a great model. I really like, there's this image in Plato's Gorgias of this tyrant who just can satisfy any pleasure that he wants because he has all the means in the world to do so. And Socrates describes him as being like a man who is itchy his whole life and he just keeps scratching and he's never satisfied, right? Because pleasure is not going to satisfy you, even if you have the limitless amount. Or he refers to it as a bucket with a hole in it, and you keep trying to refill the bucket and it's never going to fill you up because, like that's not the sort of thing that fills a bucket, right? So yeah, thinking about what's more suited to your nature. And there's a second model that is pretty akin to the first, but that's this kind of desire or goal satisfaction model. And there's more of a cognitive element built into that, right? Like, so maybe a happy life is accomplishing my goals. And once I do that, I will be happy, right? And a lot of us, like, maybe we don't think that that is the model that we hold, but I mean, you look at the Olympians who think like, once I qualify or I make it here, or I medal or I do this, or that, or the other thing, then I will be happy. And then you see post-Olympic depression, right? These people on the highest stage, they've finally done the thing that would make them happy, that would satisfy them. But then there's the day after, right? And there are more finish lines and there's more life on the other side. And so are these things part of a good life? Like investing yourself, hitting goals, certainly, but it's not the thing that's going to make you happy. So this third model, best known, I mean, Aristotle was the first to use the term. It's also taken up and kind of adapted by Thomas Aquinas and kind of neo-Aristotelian tradition. But the idea is eudaimonia as an answer. And eudaimonia, if you break it down, eu is good, daimon is spirit, good spiritedness. It's this blessed state. And what makes it unique is it's like Aristotle describes it as an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, right? And so it's this life constituted by excellence, right? Becoming a higher instance of your own kind, right? It's rational, it's appetitive, right? It involves like excellences of the emotions. It's social because we're social beings. And so the good life, what does it look like? It looks like this kind of like continual practice in becoming excellent. And I already said before, like earlier when we were talking about the university, we said there are certain material conditions involved. There are certain constraints. He says like, no one would say that a pitiable short life is a blessed one. Or he mentions like the wars in Troy. There could be famines, there could be all these things that could go wrong that could detract. It's not as though this blessed state is divorced from the material realities of your life, but the life that's constituted by excellence is on balance going to be a better kind of life than one without them. And you can see how this could be the case. Like, at first you might think, what does virtue have anything to do with happiness or blessedness or a good life? But if you think about like the individual virtues, like if you are someone who is ruled by outsized anger, right? That's going to be something that's going to, you'll get in your own way. Like, it'll imperil your friendships. You'll do things in blind rages that you regret later. Or if you lack perseverance, you'll never be able to commit to your tasks, right? You'll be irresolute and fickle, and you'll give up on your relationships and not finish your runs and not be able to like finish your essays or your work projects or whatever it is. So these virtues are ways of just kind of being able to self-govern better, but also being a better like citizen of a society as like a social creature. And so that's the model that I present as an alternative to the first two.
Now, long ago, when I was a senior in high school, before I identified as an Aristotelian, I suspended a quote in my locker, and it read, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit." Now, this, of course, is a quote from Aristotle. You mentioned repeatedly Aristotle's emphasis on actions and putting into practice certain ideas. Can you expand on that? And can you maybe differentiate the action and the habit and why it's so important in the development of virtues to institute habits?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's interesting. When Aristotle goes to define what a virtue is, he first looks at how you acquire them, because trying to figure out the sort of thing that a virtue is, like, it is a developmental question, right? So if it is something that is acquired in a habitual way, then it's going to be a special kind of habit. Oftentimes people confuse the word value and virtue. And I think the significant difference between the two, like a value is something that you it's a belief you hold that having something is preferable to not having it. So I could say like, I value my family, or I value hard work, or something like that. But values are divorced from the way you act in the world in a way that virtues are not. So virtues are these kind of settled habits. They're what you repeatedly do such that you are inclined to do it long term. You become predictably good in a certain way. And Aristotle says, like, how do you acquire them? Well, you acquire them by doing. So he says, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and so forth. So it takes the guesswork out of the question of how do I become a better person? Because it's like, well, to become more just, I just have to do just actions. I have to do them before they define me. I just have to take the first step and do them, and repeatedly do them until I become a certain kind of person. You have to do them to be them. And so that's this kind of habituation. And it sounds easy, right? Like,
It's pretty straightforward.
it is straightforward. But it also means like you are a person who you're not excellent in certain ways, and you have to act in terms of excellence until it defines you. So it's like taking the first step before you are actually that thing. And I like that.
Can I impose just briefly, because that's an
Uh-huh.
important point. I think that's often overlooked in this age. You have to acknowledge your shortcoming. That's an essential prerequisite then to being able to build a habit, to institute that habit, and then to become more virtuous. And I think so often we fail to acknowledge any shortcoming.
Yeah.
Many people are brought up many children are brought up to believe that they are flawless little beings and perfect in every conceivable way, and are in no need of improvement, no need of enhancement morally or intellectually or in any other way. And it's very hubristic. It's totally lacking in humility, and it's untrue. Of course, we all need improvements in many different ways, some more than others. So do you find that to be sort of a difficult speed bump in trying to encourage your students or even your children, if they're of age to understand this, to develop virtues and habits?
Yeah. In Aristotle, that's called the problem of beginnings. Like, how do you get the person who's not excellent to want to be excellent, to see that something is wrong with them? And throughout, like, Nicomachean ethics, and in some places in the rhetoric and in the politics, there are certain answers that are supplied to the problem of beginnings. Like, one is exemplars, right? You're supposed to look at these people who are excellent, and when you see someone who's excellent, like, you don't have to be told, oh, you're not excellent, because you see. It's called, like, you notice this character gap between yourself and this excellent person. And the thing about seeing someone who's admirable, seeing someone who exceeds you, is like, when you admire them, you're drawn to be likewise. And so sometimes if you're just surrounded by someone who's excellent or exposed to someone who's excellent, that is like what you need to get started, right? You notice, oh, I'm not great in this respect. So you have that peer in your class who is really conscientious, and you realize that you're a slob and you have to improve. Sometimes the thing that does it for us, that stimulates our like desire to improve, is like negative emotions like guilt or shame, right? Those are emotions that are pretty powerful in terms of turning you, right? A particularly powerful instance of shame could be something that, you know, compels you to want to make a change in yourself or something like that. When you're younger, sometimes it's discipline, right? So your parents say, that was rude at dinner. This is what you do to be respectful, right? You're redirected. And then sometimes it's just kind of, yeah, I mean, the exemplarism goes a long way. So having people model things kind of habituate you into, these are the norms or expectations, things like that. Those are ways to get you to be directed to the good.
Now, in your book, you divert briefly from Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and Aquinas, and you reference the Danish existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, whose differentiation of admiration and imitation I found most helpful, and I find applicable to what you're saying right now. So upon reading this, I was reminded of a passage from John Adams, the second president of the United States of America, who wrote Discourses on Davila, little read, but I find to be an extraordinary treatise published in a gazette many, many years ago. He adds one more thing to that list, to Soren Kierkegaard's list: admiration, imitation, and he adds emulation. Now, emulation, he says, is, quote, imitation and something more, a desire not only to equal or resemble, but to excel. What have you to say about this gradual ascent from mere admiration to imitation, and then finally to emulation, as you look for exemplars off of whom you can base your own self?
Yeah, that's interesting. Emulation. So in the philosophical literature, or I should say the contemporary analytic philosophical literature, these terms have like slightly different meanings. And so there are some people who say that, like, Linda Zagrebski says that, like, emulation is an instance of admiration, right? So it's within that kind of class of things. But there are others who say, no, it's a fundamentally different emotion, because emulation is kind of like the alternative term they use is benign envy. It's a kind of negative feeling towards someone who exceeds you, but it results in this like leveling up motivation. And so when I emulate a teammate, I feel bad because they're better than me. And also, I'm going to try really hard to exceed them in whatever respect. And so maybe they're so good at shooting. And so I practice and practice and I get better at them. Versus admiration, admiration doesn't have that kind of negative valence involved. It's just a positive feeling toward them. And it similarly, is inclined to imitate, to put on the excellence. The other emotion that's sometimes brought in contrast is like envy. Envy is the negative emotion, and it wants to tear them down rather than level up itself. So sometimes like you hear admiration, emulation, and envy often in conversation with each other. Uh, in any case, right, when you're observing someone who is excellent, what you want to do is put on that excellence yourself, right? So you don't want to be, in Kierkegaard's phrase, like a mere admirer. You want to be an imitator, right? So you want to do that good thing. And then you want to make it your own, right? So don't stop at the kind of, I'm just doing this because that other person is doing this. You need to like take it on as your personal project to improve in that respect. So I don't know if adding that kind of literature clarified things just now. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, yeah, like when you look at the literature, emulation, this kind of like benign envy, actually outperforms admiration, like in terms of the good that it makes you do. Like the emulators, the ones who feel that tinge of negativity, tend to be more motivated to exceed than the ones who only feel that kind of glowing positivity. So I don't know if that's like something to keep in mind too. Like having that little tinge of negativeness or negativity may not ultimately be a bad thing.
Huh, that's fascinating. Of course, we should note that it's important to be careful when choosing those of whom you will be imitative or emulative or those whom you will admire, right? And of course, you choose your exemplars based on very discriminating criteria. You touched on envy, and that was exactly the next topic about which I want to talk. You make the differentiation between benign envy and sort of malign envy, the good and the bad, but still with a tinge of negativity. And it's, as I said, fascinating to know that sometimes the negativity isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can drive one into a more productive lane. Contrarily, the malign envy can lead you down a very dark path. I wonder, with the ubiquity of our glowing rectangles, as you call them, our cell phones, our devices, do you think that there's more malign envy or benign envy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've asked my students this before. There's this one class that I teach called Excellent Thinkers, and we talk about celebrity and influence and sorts of things and their emotions and responses to them, how we respond to excellent and powerful people. And one thing that I have them do at the beginning of that unit is take out their iPhones and go on their social media and write down the names of the first 5 people that appear on their timelines who are not family or friends that they know. And I have them write down, like, why do you follow this person? And what is the dominant emotional response? Like, what do you feel when you see them? And for the most part, I mean, they're not, I mean, so there are some instances of envy, as in like the negative form, like the vice of envy. They want to have what the people don't have, but for the most part, they are not feeling anything at all. And that's something that I worry about too, because it's this kind of inert voyeurism where they are observing people's lives in a way that's passive and they're not moved to do anything about it when they see something excellent or see something as admirable or choiceworthy or something like that. They become kind of passive partakers of their social situations. And so I don't really know what to do with that yet. Like, I mean, there are instances of negative envy, but for the most part, it's this kind of passive imbibing of people's lives.
I wonder if that's not worse than malign envy, simply to be an inert voyeur, as you so aptly put it. What do you think?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I think passivity in general, and I think this kind of performance culture where people turn their attention online and it's all about like seeming a certain way instead of being a certain way, and reputation is more important than who you are. Like, I think these are all bad places to be with respect to character. I don't know how to rank it with respect to envy. Like, I don't know if I would say that one is an unqualified ill over another, but I do worry about like just passively partaking in the world instead of actively engaging with it.
Oh, sure. Again, returning to these phones, of which there's a superabundance, they could be used for such good, right? You could be using them to find exemplars whom you can emulate. You could be immersing yourself in a liberal arts education, right? You said that so often we're passively scrolling or swiping when you could be subscribing to colleges who are posting their content at no charge on YouTube, or purchasing, for instance, the great courses of which I've been a member for many years and I absolutely adore, and really for pennies on the dollar, getting a complete, comprehensive liberal arts education, um, of which some of the great scholars in the past would have been envious in their own right. So I'm saddened to know that there's just such idleness in the use of these really extraordinary devices, out of which we could get so much. Uh, it's silly, but I thought of a term while preparing for this interview, maybe applicable to you, maybe not. I thought of the word in its neologism, uh, influosopher, an influencer who's a philosopher, and perhaps you can occupy that role. Do you have any thoughts about that? Your role as a philosopher in this world of social media, and trying to lead people to virtue, into eudaimonia, into a flourishing human existence, kind of in this space, this very clicky, and by that I mean kind of clickbaity type of space. Have you given that any thought? Ways maybe to reach out and to be an influosopher or an influencer online, and all the while spreading your philosophical message?
Yeah, I think there are probably people who would be better at that than me. Just insofar as I'm like a quieter, more private person, and I know that there are some people who really like that role of being more like asking really provocative questions and fielding responses. Whereas, like, if I spend too much time online, even in fruitful engagements, it's wearying for me. Like, I get kind of tired. One thing that I do try to do, I mean, so Socrates described himself in two ways. He described himself as having this maieutic role, which is pulling information out of other people, but he also described himself as a gadfly, asking these questions. He was like pricking them for the good of their souls, right? So causing a little bit of annoyance, kind of asking the hard questions. And when I write my public philosophy columns, sometimes I like that's my self understanding. Like, I see myself as kind of asking hard questions. So recently I posed a number of questions about super shoes. And I wear super shoes. I just have some questions about them. And I think that we need to ask questions about like nature and the role of sport and how they present themselves in that context. And so I asked these questions and people were annoyed by them. But I saw it as like, just doing my proper work of being a gadfly. Or
So you're
another
a
way.
so you're a gadfly For the you're hold on. So you're a gadfly for the vaporfly crew.
Yeah, that's very good. The vaporfly gadfly. Yes, for sure. Oh my gosh. Um, and another thing that Socrates does sometimes, so one of my professors at Baylor, her name is Anne Marie Schultz, and she writes about Socratic self-disclosure. Like sometimes he'll tell something about himself, and it's a way to invite people to self-reflect. And so I do a lot of that, or I do, storytelling accompanied by philosophical questions, that's a Platonic move. So I see myself as participating in that inquiry, like participating in public space in the Socratic vein, like Socrates would always be in the agora, like he was in public having these conversations. And I don't think that philosophers should be just set off like in the ivory tower or in their offices not engaging with real people. Like that's very important to me. But as like an influencer philosopher, I like my reservations are just like um just that for me, so like I need to set boundaries in terms of how long I spend online, just because it tires me out like nothing else. Like the stimulation, people disagreeing about things that I don't have time to engage with, things like that.
Yeah. I don't think Socrates would shy away from social media. I think
No,
maybe
he'd be good at
Plato,
it.
Plato maybe, but I don't think Socrates would. I think he would have the lights shining brightly on him and a huge following. Um, so when a student first reads Plato's Republic, assuming the students still read Plato's Republic prior to entering your courses, he or she is likely to be surprised by the order in which children inhabiting the ideal polis are brought up. Before the commencement of academic work, grammar, logic, rhetoric, right, the liberal arts, he's to be trained in gymnastics. And by that, we mean general physical activities, right? The sports of the ancient Olympics, things like that. Um, so basically, training of the body must precede training of the mind. Can you flesh that out a little bit more for us? That idea of training of the body preceding training of the mind.
Yeah. I mean, both Plato and Aristotle, like it appears in for both of them. Um, And I think in large part, what were they trying to do? Trying to avoid sophistry, right? So there are people who can argue really well and they have sharp tongues and quick minds and a good command of language, but they are starting from the wrong starting points, right? It's because they're not formed to see the good. They lack that kind of self-discipline or self-governance, right? They don't love justice. And so how do they suggest that you form those things? You do it through poetry and gymnastics, right? So this kind of storytelling and song, you're introduced to these harmonies, but then in tandem with gymnastic exercise. So that's training of the body. And training of the body involves like eating well, but also these physical practices where you are learning to discipline yourself and have command of your body such that you are, I mean, the goal is to be disciplined enough to be teachable. And so if you get this kind of learner, um, who has kind of these proper affections in place and has good habits of body in place, then comes the intellectual work, then comes the logic and the rhetoric, the learning and the teaching. um so yeah, like order of education matters. And so yeah, they both say apply it right away, straight from youth. It makes no small difference that this happens right away. It makes all the difference. And so they're on the same page about that.
What you don't want is a sophistic, sharp tongue and a flabby stomach. Is that the gist?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and not to call out students, but sometimes I see this, like I have students who are so sharp and just well prepared scholars, and yet they can't get themselves to sit down and write their essays, or they can't use their freedoms well such that they are able to put the time in to study, right? And it's not just students. I mean, I think a lot of people socially are like that, like in society are like this. And that kind of self-governance, that ability to rule your passions, is a really, really important part of being a free person.
And putting a final point on this idea of body and mind, sort of matter and soul, I'll say that in pursuit of beauty, you should try to cultivate both to their utmost. Now, that will be different things for different people, right? Some of us are more genetically endowed, and some of us less. But in ancient Greece, the idea was that the body was somewhat of an outward expression of the soul, right? So a more attractive body was going to be symbolic of a more attractive soul and a more complete soul. Of course, that can go in many different directions, right? So today, if you look at a very handsome man who's a serial killer or rapist, of course, he's the physical form of a very depraved and bad soul. But I think in the original formulation of this idea, it's a quite striking thought, and something to which we should all aspire: the beautification, the perfection of the body through running, through gymnastics, through sports, and with it, a further perfection of the mind and of the soul. So we're approaching the end of this conversation, with which I've had a lot of fun. So I want to end on a couple of more lighthearted questions. First of all, a philosopher relay team. If you could create a hypothetical relay team comprising 4 philosophers, one passing the baton to the next, whom would you select, and in what order would you place them to run?
Do you mean like from the history of philosophy or contemporary philosophers?
All philosophers are eligible for this race.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's a hard question because philosophers run a lot. Like, I can't tell you how many philosophers have told me that they have a running practice on a regular basis. I think these are like 2 pretty compatible things. I don't know who I would put on my relay team. I mean, probably I would just have to go with my favorites, just because it would be fun to all be together. So probably Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and then they would hand off to me, and I would take it home. I mean, you want Aristotle to start it off because he's a peripatetic.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
he
Yes.
did a lot of walking, and I'm sure could do
And if
just
you've
fine.
ever visited Greece, and I've had the pleasure to visit that beautiful country, it's very mountainous. There are a lot of hills.
Yes.
And as I was walking up and down those hills, and I went to Delphi, I was imagining these robed men and women, walking up and down, the peripatetics, everybody, the cynics, everybody walking all around in this climate, beautiful Mediterranean climate, but with a lot of altitude change. So you had better believe that their calves were well developed.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, excellent choices. I'm glad that you inserted yourself. And now I think we have an idea of the answer to this next question, and I'll pose it regardless. If you could be accompanied by one philosopher on a long run, let's say a 50-mile run, by whom would you want to be accompanied and why?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Honestly, my goodness. Well, Aquinas was not an, I don't think he had a very athletic build. However,
Do you know his?
you know,
Do you know what his nickname was?
yeah, dumb ox, but yeah, so
A
he's
dumb
like,
ox.
yeah, slow moving.
Unlikely to be fleet of foot.
Yes. However, I don't know, like, right. So, what he had that vision at the end of his life where he realized, like, looking back at everything he had done, he said he realized it was all like whatever, filthy rags or just like nothing. Like, he got it all wrong. And I just want to know what he saw, like, what was in that vision, or like, what was the clarity that happened, like that. Like, I don't know. That's always kind of, yeah, that's something that I want to know. So I'd give him the space to talk about it.
All right, so you would you would run alongside the dumb ox for 50 miles. It'd be a slow run. You'd have to
Yeah.
really decrease your pace.
Yep.
Well, Sabrina, you've been so generous with your time. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for agreeing to join me for this conversation. I think it's been enlightening and wide reaching. Your book is fabulous. I greatly enjoyed it. And I, of course, encourage all of the listeners and viewers to purchase themselves a copy, to share it with a friend. It's not exclusively for runners or those engaged in physical activities competitively or just for the love of the sport. But it is ideally suited for that population. Again, though, applicable to anyone. It gives you a very good basis in Aristotelian philosophy, just the philosophy of Aristotle, and Sabrina does a wonderful job of weaving that in with sort of some modern philosophical ideas as well. So I applaud you on this book. I will, of course, provide a link in the show notes below so people can access it and hopefully purchase a copy. Um, and I think that's it. I'll ask you, is there any where you want to direct people so that they can reach you or follow some of your writings or your videos or your race details?
Yeah, well, I write a column for ironfar.com every month. It's called The Examined Run, like the book. I also write for Psychology Today on a monthly basis about character. And you can find me on most social media platforms just as Sabrina B. Little. And I have a website, sabrinalittle.com, where you can find out my research.
Yeah. And that's where I reached you, and you were so gracious to accept my invitation. So again, Professor Little, Sabrina, thank you so much for joining me today. And to everyone listening and watching out there, feel free to subscribe to this channel, share it with family and friends, and until next time, fare thee well. From your dear friend, Daniel Finneran. This is Finneran's Wake, signing off.